May 15, 1943, in the Russell Islands deep in the Solomon Sea, a young Marine pilot named Lieutenant James Walsh from Pittsburgh watched an F4U Corsair slam onto the rough strip with 2 hard bounces before skidding dangerously toward the line of coconut palms that marked the edge of the field. The pilot barely managed to wrestle the wild machine to a stop, and for a long moment the plane just sat there idling like some wounded animal deciding whether to die or bite. Walsh had flown enough fighters to know when something felt wrong, and the Corsair felt wrong in every possible way. Its nose was too long, blocking the pilot's view. Its wings bent sharply downward before angling up again like a twisted bird, and the cockpit sat so far back it seemed like an afterthought bolted onto a monster engine. The Marines joked that the Corsair was the enemy eliminator because it killed more of its own pilots than Japanese. The Navy had already abandoned trying to land it on carriers after too many fatal accidents. Now the Marines were stuck with 200 of these bent-wing brutes that no one wanted but everyone was expected to fly. Walsh had spent 8 months fighting in F4F Wild, Cat's slow, sturdy machines that felt honest in the air even when outmatched. He had survived 2 shoot-downs by Zeros and walked away both times. The Wildcat gave warnings before it betrayed you. The Corsair looked like it kept secrets and none of them good. Sergeant Tony Russo, the mechanic from Detroit who had been patching planes together since the hell of Guadalcanal spat tobacco juice into the dust and stared at the Corsair like it, insulted him personally. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roared with 2,000 horsepower, giving the Corsair enormous strength. On paper, it was the most powerful fighter America had produced. 4 tons empty 650 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds for each gun and speeds that dwarfed the Wildcat. But paper did not reflect reality. Reality was 4 pilots killed in training without ever seeing a Japanese plane. Lieutenant Bobby Chen, the pilot who climbed shakily from the cockpit, looked like he had aged years in the past 20 minutes. He was only 23 from San Francisco, and this was his first real attempt to land the Corsair. He had stalled it twice in the pattern and bounced it 3 times on final. The aircraft behaved like it was eager to flip and kill him. Walsh watched him wipe sweat from his eyes even though it was still early morning. The humidity hung heavy, making every breath feel like drowning. By 7, the heat had climbed past 95 degrees. Major Gregory Bowington, known across the service for his flying skills, his temper and his drinking, stood beneath the shade of a coconut grove where he briefed the squadron. He had fought with the Flying Tigers in China and knew the Zero better than anyone in the unit. He told them plainly that Japanese pilots would laugh when they saw the Corsair. They would call it heavy, ugly, clumsy. They would fly circles around it in their light Zero fighters built with aluminum so thin a man could almost punch through the skin. The Zero weighed half of what the Corsair weighed. It could climb like a dream and turn inside the space of a phone booth. The Japanese had been fighting since 1937, gathering 6 years of combat experience. The Americans had barely been at war for 18 months, but Bowington had a plan. Do not turn with them. Do not play their game. The Corsair was a demon in a dive. It could plunge straight down at 450 miles per hour, while the Zero would tear apart at 350. Use gravity, use weight, use power. Make 1 pass, take 1 shot, and climb back to altitude before the enemy recovered. The 6 Browning guns together fired more than 7,000 rounds each minute, a river of half-inch bullets heavy enough to cut a Zero in 2. Chen raised his hand and asked what happened if a Zero forced them into a turning fight. Bowington smiled in that grim way that meant someone was not coming home. Then he said that if a Zero trapped you in a turning fight, you were already dead, so you might as well ram him. A few days later, Captain Michael O'Brien, the intelligence officer, brought new photos showing heavy Zero buildups on Bougainville, 70 at one airfield and 40 more at another. Japanese reinforcements arriving for a major push. The veterans from Midway and Guadalcanal were mostly gone, replaced now by younger pilots, still dangerous but not the masters of 1942. Every morning Walsh fought simply to keep the Corsair from killing him. Takeoff demanded locking the tail wheel, controlling the savage torque of the engine, and dragging the tail up fast enough to see the strip ahead. The stall came with no warning. 1 second stable flight, the next a violent snap roll toward the jungle. Landing required total faith because you could not see the runway until the last moment. You flew the pattern blind, trusting training and luck. Yet when it worked, when the Corsair climbed to 25,000 feet and Walsh pushed its nose over into a dive, the world transformed. The airplane did not fly, it fell with purpose like a thrown spear. Speed built fast, 300, then 350, then 400 miles per hour. At such speeds, zeros below seemed frozen. They might see him maybe start to turn, but physics ruled the sky. The Corsair dropped a mile every 9 seconds. The guns, shaped by Russo and his crew, were aligned, perfectly converging at 300 yards into a deadly point where all streams met. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds burned at 3,000 degrees, hot enough to ignite fuel vapor and melt aluminum instantly. Japanese pilots once joked that American guns shot pretty golden sparks. They stopped joking when those sparks melted their planes. On June 30th, 1943, Walsh prepared for his first combat escorting bombers toward Munda, his hands trembling as the powerful engine came to life, and the bent-wing bird prepared again to decide who lived and who died. 2,000 horsepower trembled through the control stick as Walsh eased the throttle forward in the heavy morning heat. Even at dawn, the temperature felt close to 100 degrees, and inside the Corsair cockpit, the trapped air reached well over 110. His gloves were already soaked with sweat, and his breathing sounded loud under the rubber of the oxygen mask. He locked the tail wheel and fed in steady right rudder, because if he missed even a little, the airplane would spin sideways and tear itself apart on the runway. The bent wing machine lunged forward like something alive and angry. At 70 miles per hour, it finally lifted clear of the coral strip, and Walsh retracted the gear and climbed to join the formation. By 10,000 feet, the air turned cool and thin. By 20,000, it dropped to 20 below zero, and frost crept up the inside of the canopy. The Corsair, however, did not care. Its huge engine kept pulling as if the entire Pacific sky belonged to it alone. They crossed New Georgia at 25,000 feet. Below them, the jungle stretched in endless green waves, broken only by rivers of bright blue water. It looked peaceful, but every man in the flight knew Japanese fighters could rise from any cloud bank without warning. Then Chen spoke over the radio, saying he saw zeros at 2 o'clock high. Walsh scanned the sky, but saw only sun glare until a flash of reflected light revealed 15, maybe 20 zeros diving from 3,000 feet above the bombers. Perfect position for a kill. Major Boeington reminded them of the one rule that mattered: do not turn. When the zeros dive on you, push straight down and let gravity carry you, because they cannot follow at high speed. The first Japanese fighters peeled off in graceful pairs, almost beautiful as they curved downward. When they came close, however, the beauty vanished, replaced by the streaking red glow of 20mm cannon rounds sliding past Walsh's canopy like glowing marbles of death. One hit would blow a hole big enough to put a head through. Walsh shoved the stick forward, dropping the nose into a near-vertical 70-degree dive. The airspeed indicator spiraled up 300. 350, 400. The control stick grew heavy as pressure built, but the Corsair stayed responsive. Zero tried to follow Walsh, but the Japanese pilot began falling behind. At 350, the Zero could no longer stay in one piece. Walsh watched it shrink in the mirror before it broke off the chase. He kept diving until his altimeter unwound past 15,000 and 10,000, then 5,000 feet. He pulled out hard at 2,000. His body felt crushed under 6 and 7 GS. The edges of his vision turned gray and shapes blurred, but he held control until the aircraft leveled. No Zero followed him. That was the one advantage the bent-wing monster gave them. The dive was a sanctuary. Chen, however, was not so lucky that day. A cannon round ripped a hole in his wing, tearing through hydraulic lines. As he turned toward base, hydraulic fluid streamed behind him and his flaps were dead. Without flaps, the landing would be nearly impossible. He would touch down at 140 miles per hour with little hope of stopping before the jungle. Walsh stayed with him circling as Chen lined up. Pieces of aluminum peeled off the wing in the slipstream. At 135 miles per hour, Chen touched down fast, unable to brake. The Corsair raced across the strip toward the trees. Chen kicked full rudder, forcing the plane into a deliberate ground loop. The aircraft spun violently, throwing up dust and rocks. The landing gear snapped. The right wing dug into the coral and the Corsair somersaulted before stopping 50 feet from the palms. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Chen crawled out, bleeding but alive. The Corsair had tried to kill him, but had saved him as well. That same day, they lost 2 other pilots without a single Zero firing at them. Lieutenant Tom Morrison from Dallas stalled on approach with no warning. 1 second, flying 1 second, tumbling into the sea. Lieutenant Pete Kowalski from Chicago locked onto a Zero during a dive. His aim was true, but he fell victim to target fixation and waited too long to pull out. He hit the jungle still pulling GS. The Corsair was teaching them the hard way. Every mistake was death. On July 16, 1943, they launched a fighter sweep that would test everything they had learned. 16 Corsairs rose into the sky without bombers escorting them. The job was to hunt and destroy enemy fighters over Bougainville. They found trouble quickly. Nearly 40 Zeros were climbing from Kahili in tight, disciplined groups. Some of them waggled their wings in a taunt, a silent dare to come play. Everyone in the American formation knew the rule: never turn with a Zero. Walsh was at 28,000 feet when he spotted the enemy below. They had the perfect advantage, 13,000 feet to build speed before contact. Boeington ordered attacks in pairs, 1 to fire, 1 to cover, no lingering in the fight. Dive, fire, climb, escape. Let energy be the weapon. Walsh picked a Zero, climbing alone through 18,000 feet. He pushed over into the dive. The Corsair roared downward like falling iron. 350, 400, 420. The Zero filled his gun sight and began to turn too slowly. Walsh fired at 300 yards. Russo had sighted the guns with perfect precision. 6 converging streams of 50 caliber fire met on the Zero's engine cowling. The first rounds shattered metal, the next ignited fuel. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck with white-hot fury. The Zero did not just fall, it disintegrated. Walsh climbed through heavy G-forces, watching only debris where an aircraft had been. But the Japanese were learning too. Another Zero dove away before Walsh could line up. Walsh followed, and the enemy pilot used a trick of his own. The Zero suddenly pulled an 11G loop, impossible for any American plane. The pilot likely blacked out, yet the aircraft whipped upward behind Walsh, ready to kill. Walsh had 2 seconds left when Bobby Chen appeared from above, diving at 450 miles per hour. 6 guns flashed and the Zero tore apart before it could fire. Chen pulled up so violently that blood vessels burst in his eyes, but he survived the maneuver. That was how the air war went in those months. Dive, climb, strike, escape. The pilots who tried to dogfight died quickly. The ones who used the rules lived, but altitude ran out eventually. Each dive started lower. Lieutenant David Parker from Memphis ran out of sky over Shortland Island. He made 3 kills before diving into a cloud deck with 2 Zeros behind him. They pulled up safely. Parker never did. Whether he blacked out or pushed too far, no one knew. The jungle kept the truth for itself. On August 15th, the Japanese shifted their tactics. Instead of climbing to higher altitudes, they remained low around 5,000 feet, hiding in clouds, trying to lure the Americans downward, where turning speed mattered. This tactic might have worked against Wildcats or P-40 fighters, but the Corsair held one more advantage. From 30,000 feet, Walsh could see everything. The battlefield spread below him like a living map. He called out positions for Chen, who fought 3 Zeros at 8,000 feet, and Morrison engaged others above them. Then Walsh saw something else. 20 Zeros hovering inside the clouds at 3,000 feet, ready to ambush any Corsair foolish enough to come down. Walsh told his wingman Jimmy Stewart, the quiet math teacher turned aviator, to stay high. Then Walsh did something insane even by his own standards. He rolled the Corsair upside down and dropped into a vertical 90-degree dive. The airspeed indicator snapped toward its limit, 400, 450, 470. The whole aircraft shook, and the wind screamed across the wings. The controls stiffened, frozen by the force of the dive. At almost 500 miles per hour, Walsh punched through the clouds, and the ambush force appeared below him, spread out in loose circles, unaware of death falling from above. He had 2 seconds to fire. He lined up the lead Zero at 400 yards and squeezed the trigger. The rounds struck like artillery. The Zero's tail snapped clean off. The rest of the plane tumbled like shredded paper. Walsh pulled out at 500 feet under crushing GS that turned his vision red, but the Corsair held together. He climbed back toward 8,000 feet with 300 rounds left in each gun. Enough for 2 more passes. The enemy pilots were rattled by now. They had never seen anything survive such a dive. Some attempted to climb into a fight they could not win. Others fled toward the deck. One veteran Zero pilot used a clever trap, cutting his engine and throwing down full flaps until his speed collapsed to 90 miles per hour. Walsh overshot at 400 miles per hour, leaving him momentarily exposed. The Zero accelerated and gave chase, but Walsh used the Corsair's one true gift, climb rate. He pulled the bent wing fighter into a steep zoom climb rising 3,000 feet per minute. The Zero stalled and spun away. When they landed later, the guns were scorched white from heat. Hydraulics leaked. Wing skins buckled, but no Corsairs were lost that day. 7 Zeros confirmed destroyed. The Japanese who once mocked the bent-wing bird now called it whistling death for the sound it made when diving. Yet the cost to the pilots grew quietly. Chen shook so badly after missions he could not hold a cup. Walsh had dropped from 170 pounds to 140. They were burning themselves out one mission at a time. The doctor told them the human body could not endure 10G pulls without suffering invisible damage. Organs shifted, blood vessels burst, bones compressed. Each battle aged them a month, and the war was only beginning. Walsh began his 3rd major dive of the campaign with the same cold focus that had kept him alive since the first day he strapped into the bent wing beast. The Corsair tipped forward into the fall, and the airspeed needle shot upward almost faster than his eyes could track. 300, 350, 400, 420. The Zero below him grew rapidly in the gun sight. The Japanese pilot saw him at the last moment and tried to slip into a tight turn, but a Zero could not outrun gravity, nor could it escape the deadly precision of 6 Browning 50 caliber guns when they were bore-sighted to meet at 300 yards. Walsh squeezed the trigger. For 2 full seconds the Corsair spat fire. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds carved through aluminum skin as if it were paper, and the sudden burst of heat caused the fuel tank to erupt. There was no falling wreck, no slow descent. The Zero simply vanished in a flash of white heat as if erased from the sky. Walsh pulled up fast, nearly blacking out when 8GS pressed him deep into the seat. His vision narrowed to a tunnel until only a thin ring of light remained, but the Corsair climbed like it was pulled upward by some invisible chain. When the pressure eased, he glanced down. Nothing left of the enemy he had just destroyed. Not a wing, not a tail, not a trail of smoke. Just empty sky. Down below, the Japanese pilots began adapting to American tactics. When Walsh dove on the next Zero, the pilot refused the turn, and instead dropped into a steep dive of his own, using the Corsair's trick against it. Walsh followed, closing the distance slowly. The Zero pilot waited until Walsh was deeply committed, then pulled a maneuver only his aircraft could perform. He yanked back hard, pulling 11 GS. A human body could barely remain conscious under that strain. Still, the Zero arced skyward, looping behind Walsh with frightening speed. Now the American pilot had 2 seconds to live. The cannon of the Zero began flashing. Then Bobby Chen arrived from above, falling with the fury of a meteor. At 450 miles per hour, he fired one devastating burst that tore the Zero apart. The engine blew free from the fuselage. The wings folded back like broken arms. The pilot fell out lifeless and riddled with holes before the wreck even began to drop. Chen pulled out of the dive so hard his vision exploded into red from burst blood vessels. Yet he lived. That was the rhythm of the air war. Dive, strike, climb, survive. The men who forgot that rhythm died quickly. Some in seconds, some after one mistake too many. Lieutenant David Parker from Memphis learned that lesson on Shortland Island. He had made 3 kills earlier in the day and was laughing into the radio when he dropped into his final dive. 2 Zeros chased him. They tried to follow but pulled out at 5,000 feet. Parker did not. Whether he blacked out or misjudged his descent, or simply reached a point where bravery became fatal, no one would ever know. The jungle swallowed him without a sound. The island never gave him back. On August 15th, the Japanese changed the battlefield again. Instead of climbing to meet the Corsairs high in the sky, they waited low under 5,000 feet, using scattered clouds as cover. Their goal was simple: pull the big American fighters into the arena where the Zero reigned as the undisputed master. Inside tight turns inside slow fights inside the knife fight that the Corsair could never win. But Walsh and the others fought from the heavens. From 30,000 feet, he could see nearly the entire engagement like a moving map beneath him. He called warnings to Chen, who fought 3 Zeros at 8,000 feet. To Morrison, who dove on 2 more near 12,000 feet. To Kowalski, who climbed away from another pair. Walsh finally spotted the trap. 20 Zeros hovering at 3,000 feet ready to ambush anyone who fell for the bait. Walsh told his wingman Jimmy Stewart, the shy math teacher from Kansas, to stay high and hold position. Then Walsh executed one of the most reckless dives in the entire Solomon campaign. He rolled inverted and pointed the Corsair straight down. 90 degrees, pure vertical. The bent wing bird howled as air ripped across its surfaces. The needle climbed 400, 450, 470. The entire aircraft shook violently, and Walsh had to fight to keep his hands steady. The controls stiffened to the point of near lock. Yet still he dove. The clouds below rose up like a wall, and then shattered as he punched through at nearly 500 miles per hour. The ambush force was there flying loose circles, unaware that death was already inside their formation. Walsh had 2 seconds, no more. He lined up the lead fighter, a green Zero marked with kill symbols on its fuselage. At 400 yards he fired. At such speed the rounds did not behave like bullets, but like sledgehammers. The Zero's tail section ripped free and vanished. The shock tore apart the rest of the structure, and the fighter cartwheeled into empty space. Walsh pulled out at 500 feet. The GS clawed at his vision, turning it red, then nearly black. His ribs felt like they might snap, and the Corsair's wings bent dangerously, but they held. Designed for war, designed for punishment, designed to bring men back from the edge. He climbed back through 8,000 feet and checked ammunition. 300 rounds left in each gun, enough for 2 more passes. The Japanese formation broke apart in confusion. Some pilots attempted to climb to fight. A mistake. The Corsair controlled the upward battle. Its engine hauled it skyward with raw power. Others dove toward the ocean, hoping to escape at low altitude. The Corsair followed effortlessly, gaining speed with every foot. One veteran Zero pilot pulled a clever trick while Walsh attacked. As Walsh dove, he cut his engine and threw out full flaps. His airspeed dropped instantly from 200 miles per hour to 90. Walsh overshot at 400. The Zero then restarted his engine and closed in on Walsh's tail. For 10 dangerous seconds, Walsh was in real danger. Then he used the Corsair's natural strength. He pulled into a steep climb at 3,000 feet per minute. The Zero stalled out and spiraled downward. When the missions ended that day, the Corsairs limped home, gun barrels scorched white, hydraulics leaking, wing skins buckled, but all returned. 7 Zeros had been destroyed without the loss of a single Corsair. Whistling death, the Japanese now called the bent wing fighter for the terrifying sound it produced in a dive. Yet the pilots paid a price with each mission. Chen could barely hold a cup after missions. His hands shook uncontrollably from the strain of adrenaline that never faded. Walsh now weighed 140 pounds, down 30 from when he arrived. Their bodies were burning through themselves under the repeated hammering of 10G maneuvers. Captain Weinstein, the doctor from Baltimore, tried to explain it. The human body was never meant for this. Blood vessels burst, organs shifted, bones compressed. Every flight aged them a month, but the war did not care and the sky showed no mercy. And every day the men climbed into their Corsairs again, because the alternative was letting the enemy take the Pacific one island at a time. Walsh's dive and the veterans' escape trick became the talk of the squadron, but the next missions proved that even when the Corsair outflew the Zero, the pilots themselves were slowly breaking under the strain. The day they returned with 7 kills and no losses, the mechanics found bullet holes large enough to push a fist through in Morrison's wings, and hydraulic lines leaking red fluid like open wounds. Russo ran his hand across the mangled skin of the aircraft and muttered that he could see straight through the plane. Yet somehow it had brought Morrison home. The Japanese had stopped laughing at the Corsair by then. They called it whistling death for the way the air shrieked through the bent wings during a dive, and though the name sounded dramatic, the strain of earning, it was slowly destroying the men who flew it. Chen shook constantly, not from fear, but from the burn of adrenaline that never faded. His fingers trembled even when he tried to light a cigarette, and sweat ran down his temples long after landing. Walsh had lost 30 pounds since arriving. He barely recognized his own reflection in the polished metal of the cowling. The doctor, Captain Weinstein, explained that the human body was not made to survive 10G pulls several times a day. Blood vessels ruptured, joints compressed, organs shifted. He said every mission aged them a month, maybe more. On September 3, 1943, intelligence officers warned of something large forming. 150 Zero fighters were concentrating around Rabaul in preparation for an offensive. The problem was distance. Rabaul sat at the very edge of the Corsair's range. They would have only minutes over the target before fuel forced them home. Boeington offered a solution more reckless than most of his ideas. Belly tanks, extra fuel strapped beneath each Corsair, even though the plane already handled like an unbroken horse. The mechanics welded the attachment points through the night, while Walsh watched sparks fly across the darkened grove. At dawn on September 5th, the squadron launched through heavy mist. The Corsairs waddled on takeoff under the extra weight. Walsh felt the center of gravity shift dangerously with every gust as they climbed. Through 15,000 feet ice crawled across the leading edges. Through 20,000 feet the air hit 40 degrees below zero, and then Walsh noticed his belly tank was leaking. Fuel streamed behind him in flickering ribbons. A single spark could have turned the Corsair into a falling torch. Ahead, New Britain broke through the clouds with Rabaul's Simpson Harbor filled with ships. Above it rose the largest formation Walsh had ever seen, at least 100 Zero fighters stacked in layers from 15,000 to 25,000 feet. They were waiting. They knew the Americans were coming. Boeington ordered everyone to drop tanks. Walsh pulled the release and felt instant relief as the tank tumbled away. The Corsair felt lighter and eager, like a beast freed from chains. But the Japanese had learned. They did not climb to meet the Americans. They spread out in layers, ensuring the Corsairs would have to dive through multiple levels of defense. One mistake and a pilot would find himself boxed in. Boeington, however, had learned too. Instead of one massive dive, he ordered sequential waves. 4 Corsairs dove first, while 20 covered above. As they pulled out the next 4 dove, continuous pressure, continuous chaos, Walsh was in the 3rd wave and watched the battle unfold below him. The first group tore through the Japanese ranks at incredible speed, scattering Zeros like startled birds. The second wave followed, leaving smoke trails and falling wreckage. When his turn came, Walsh pushed his nose down into a 70-degree dive. The airspeed rose 400, 420, 440. A Zero flicked into his sights trying to dodge left, Walsh trimmed slightly kicked rudder and fired a 2-second burst. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through both wings, and the fuselage buckled as each wing folded away. The rest of the plane spiraled as its pilot fell trapped inside. Walsh pulled up through crushing GS and climbed again. The sky had become a swirling cage of fire and smoke. Below, more Corsairs streaked through the formation. Patterson from Rhode Island made a fatal error. He tried to turn with a 0. In seconds, the enemy fighter slid onto his tail and walked cannon fire up his fuselage. A round pierced his oil cooler. Smoke poured out in a thick trail. Patterson bailed out above Simpson Harbor, but Japanese gunners shot him while he hung from his parachute. Morrison found himself boxed in by 3 zeros during his second run. He fired all his remaining rounds, and then made his final decision. He pushed the throttle forward and rammed the nearest 0 head-on. Both planes exploded in a sphere of flame. His last calm words over the radio were asking someone to send his kid sister flowers for her birthday next week. The battle lasted 12 minutes by the clock. To the pilots it felt like 12 hours. When Boyington finally called withdrawal, Walsh checked his ammunition. 60 rounds per gun, barely enough for one pass. Worse, his fuel gauge hovered frighteningly low. They would never make it back to base. Treasury Island lay 40 miles closer. It was their only hope. The flight home was silent. Each man counted fuel and distance and time in his head. The Corsair burned 20 gallons per hour at cruise. Walsh's gauge showed 15 gallons. They were flying on borrowed minutes. He leaned the mixture until the engine coughed and dropped to minimum revolutions, trying to squeeze every mile from fading fumes. Walsh heard Chen announce that his engine had quit 50 miles from Treasury. Chen sounded almost peaceful as he said he was ditching. The Corsair glided like a stone, falling 1,200 feet per minute. Chen found a calm patch of water-lowered flaps and hit at 90 miles per hour. The aircraft skipped once, twice, then buried its nose and vanished. Chen escaped just before it sank. Sharks circled, but Chen drove them off with his .45 firing at the water whenever one came too close. A Catalina rescued him 3 hours later. Walsh's engine failed on final approach to Treasury. One moment it was roaring, the next it was silent. The Corsair became a dead glider, dropping fast. The runway was in sight, but he was too low. He would hit the trees 50 yards short. Then Jimmy Stewart dove his Corsair beneath Walsh and waggled his wings, creating a wave of turbulent air that lifted Walsh an extra few precious feet. The dead Corsair cleared the trees by the width of a hand, slammed onto the strip, collapsed its gear, and slid 800 feet in a shower of sparks. Walsh crawled out shaking as Stewart performed a victory roll overhead. That day they destroyed 31 Zeros. They lost 8 Corsairs, 5 pilots dead, 3 wounded. They won the battle but not the war. Their bodies were wearing out, their spirits thinning, and the Japanese still had pilots to spare while the Marines did not. That night Walsh's hands would not stop shaking, not from fear, something deeper, something breaking inside. The victory at Treasury Island did nothing to ease the strain on the squadron, because even as the Corsairs proved themselves the finest killers in the Pacific, the Japanese shifted tactics again, and again forcing the weary Marines into a constant cycle of adaptation. By October, the weather over the Solomons turned vicious, with storms rolling in from the sea and low clouds covering the islands like layers of dirty cotton. The Japanese used this weather as a cloak, sending small groups of fighters low, and hidden forcing the Americans to come down into the turning fights they dreaded. To counter this, the Corsair pilots began flying in larger teams of 8, instead of 4 always keeping half the group high while the others dove. The goal was simple. Never let a Zero catch a Corsair alone. Always have someone above ready to strike. But even with new tactics, the strain slowly ate away at them. For the Japanese, a dead pilot could be replaced. For the Marines, every loss cut deep because there were fewer and fewer left. At night, the Japanese added another weapon. Harassing bombers flying so low they slipped under radar, soared in unseen, and dropped their loads before the Corsairs could even get airborne. Every night the sirens wailed. Sometimes real, sometimes false. Either way, the Marines jolted awake scrambling for aircraft. They averaged 3 hours of sleep. Exhaustion dulled reflexes, and dull reflexes meant death. Lieutenant Roger White from Oregon learned this the hard way on October 15th. In the middle of an engagement, he forgot to check his 6 o'clock for one brief moment. A Zero was waiting exactly where training warned it would be. The cannon rounds marched up his fuselage. Most hit armor and glanced off, but one slipped through a gap between plates and tore through his back, exiting through his chest. White somehow stayed conscious long enough to get his Corsair home. He died as corpsmen pulled him from the seat. His final words were about Oregon rain and how he missed it. 5 days later, Walsh nearly joined him. A routine patrol turned into an ambush when 12 Zeros exploded out of a cloud bank at 8,000 feet. Walsh never saw them until tracer fire streaked past his canopy. Red glowing marbles of death. He threw the Corsair hard left. The G-forces inflated his flight suit and pressed his ribs inward. The Zero behind him stayed glued to his tail. This pilot was no novice, a veteran. He did not overshoot. He matched every move. Walsh tried barrel rolls, chandelles, split-S dives. The Zero stayed with him like it was tied to his aircraft by an invisible rope. Walsh felt the next burst coming, felt death waiting a heartbeat away. With nothing left to try, he shoved the stick full forward. The Corsair dropped into negative GS. His head slammed into the canopy. Blood rushed upward. His eyes felt like they might burst. The Zero hesitated for half a second, confused. That was enough. Walsh rolled through the bottom of the drop, pulled up, and came around behind the Zero. One burst, the enemy engine exploded in flames. Oil spattered the sky. The pilot never escaped, but as Walsh leveled out, he tasted copper in his mask. The negative GS had torn something inside him. When he landed, he barely stayed conscious. Captain Weinstein found internal bleeding. Not instantly fatal, but serious enough to ground him for 2 weeks while his body struggled to repair itself. Walsh spent those weeks watching other men take his place. Watching funerals, watching empty bunks. By November, the squadron was winning battles but losing themselves. The Corsair was proving itself with a kill ratio nearly 12-1. But the men were burning alive inside their uniforms. Chen developed ulcers and vomited blood between missions. Kowalski went gray at 24. Walsh dropped another 10 pounds until he barely hit 130. The doctor said their bodies were consuming themselves. Using muscle tissue as fuel, November 11th arrived Armistice Day, 25 years after the war to end all wars. Walsh remembered his father returning from France, haunted by things he only mentioned once in drunken sorrow. Walsh finally understood why words failed him. How could he describe watching Morrison ram a Zero? How could he describe Chen ditching in shark-filled waters or the smell of hydraulic fluid mixed with blood? That day, the mission sent them back over Rabaul. The Japanese were desperate now. Kamikaze attacks were not yet official policy, but some pilots chose death anyway. 1 Zero, crippled and burning, aimed itself directly at Jimmy Stewart. Walsh watched helplessly as both planes vanished in a violent fireball. Stewart, the quiet math teacher who had lifted Walsh over the trees at Treasury, died without a final word. Something inside Walsh went cold. Not anger, not fear, something deeper, something dead. He dove on a Zero and killed it without emotion. Climbed, found another, killed it, again and again. When he returned, he had 5 kills. Ace in a day. The squadron cheered. Boington slapped his back. Walsh felt nothing. That night he sat alone in his tent trying to remember Stewart's face. He could not. December brought the final push. The Japanese Navy was pulling back but wanted one last blow. On December 17th, they launched 200 fighters and bombers at Rabaul. It became the biggest air battle of the Solomon campaign. Walsh flew on Chen's wing now, because there were hardly any veterans left. 16 Corsairs met 40 Zero escorts and 30 bombers at 25,000 feet. The sky became a maze of rising and falling fighters. Walsh surrendered completely to instinct. Dive, fire, climb. Repeat. His guns overheated glowing red, but he kept firing. An ammunition can cooked off and blasted a hole 3 feet wide in his left wing, but the Corsair kept flying. Chen was hit by a 20mm round that burned through his engine and sprayed oil across the windscreen. Blind, he still called out positions until the engine ceased. He bailed out, barely clearing the wing. A Zero lined up on his falling chute. Walsh instantly dove, placing himself between Chen and the attacker. Cannon shells slammed into his armor plate like sledgehammers. The plate held. The Zero did not see Kowalski descending from above. A burst from 6 Brownings erased it. They saved Chen, but lost 5 Corsairs that day. 18 Zeros died, 12 bombers fell, a victory in numbers but not in spirit. Walsh flew 3 more missions like an empty shell, dead inside, precise as a machine. Until on December 23rd, his body quietly quit. He climbed into his Corsair for dawn patrol and could not remember how to start the engine. He stared at the controls for 2 hours until a corpsman found him crying without realizing it. The doctor said it was combat fatigue. 138 missions when he should have gone home after 50. His body had forgotten how to live without adrenaline. They sent him to a hospital in Australia. Clean sheets, smiling nurses. Peace, but Walsh felt like a shadow drifting through a world that no longer made sense. The hospital in Australia felt unreal to Walsh, as if he had stepped out of the world he knew and into a place built for someone else. The sheets were clean, the hallways quiet. The air smelled of disinfectant instead of burned oil and cordite. The nurses smiled at him with gentle eyes that made him feel even more out of place, because after 138 missions he no longer knew how to exist without the roar of the Corsair's engine vibrating through his bones. His hands shook constantly, though not from fear. It was as if his body had forgotten how to stop producing adrenaline. His heart raced for no reason. His sleep came in short gasps, thick with dreams of burning planes and friends screaming over broken radios. Even while awake, he sometimes heard ghost echoes of gunfire drifting through his thoughts. 2 weeks after he arrived, Chen appeared in the same ward, pale thin, and clutching his stomach. His ulcers had grown so severe that he vomited blood between missions. The doctors grounded him before he bled to death in the cockpit. He shuffled into Walsh's room without speaking, sank into a chair, and stared out the window. They did not need words. Both weighed around 120 pounds. Both looked 20 years older than their ages. Both carried ghosts that refused to leave. The war had not stopped, even though their bodies forced them to stop flying. Each day, new wounded arrived. Some walked in silent and hollow. Others screamed in the night. Walsh barely spoke until January, when a new doctor appeared. Commander Sarah Goldstein, a Navy psychiatrist from New York, stepped into the ward with the force of someone who refused to let broken men fade away quietly. She threw away their sedatives on the first day, saying they were not machines to be shut off but men who needed to feel again. Walsh hated her for that at first. Feeling anything was the last thing he wanted. But she pushed them. She made them talk not about maneuvers or tactics, but about Morrison ramming a Zero and Stewart lifting Walsh above the trees, and White's last words about Oregon rain. She made them remember the human pieces they tried to bury. Slowly, something inside Walsh began to thaw, very slowly. He started eating more than a few bites at a time. He gained weight 5 pounds, then 10. He still shook sometimes, but less violently. Chen began joking again, though the humor was darker than before. They were not healed. They would never be healed, but they were functional, as Goldstein called it. Able to walk in the world without falling apart every few minutes. In February, word reached the ward that the Corsair had been reclassified. The plane, originally dismissed as too dangerous for carriers, had become the premier marine fighter bomber in the Pacific. 11-to-1 kill ratio, 2,300 enemy aircraft destroyed. The bent-wing bird no one wanted had become the very thing holding the line. The Japanese who once mocked it now fled when they saw its shape cutting through the sky. Walsh felt pride but also sorrow, because every one of those victories had been purchased with the lives of men he knew. In March, he received orders to return home, not to a frontline squadron but to Pensacola to train new pilots. He boarded the transport ship with Chen standing beside him, saluting quietly before turning back to the hospital. Chen would return to combat despite the doctor's warnings. He did not know how to do anything else. When the ship reached San Francisco, Walsh stepped onto the dock, wearing a uniform that sagged from his still thin frame. His mother stood there waiting and tried not to cry when she saw him. His father, the silent veteran of the Great War, simply nodded, a gesture between two men who understood horrors too deep for words. The train ride east lasted 4 days. Walsh stared from the window, watching farmlands and small towns pass by. Kids played baseball in fields. Women hung laundry in the sun. Men repaired fences or tractors. It all felt distant, like he was watching another world, another lifetime. Normal life had kept moving, while he had been fighting gravity and death at 30,000 feet. When he reached Pensacola, he met the first class of trainees. Young, wide-eyed ensigns eager for glory. They looked at him with awe. Walsh wanted to tell them to turn around to leave while they still could go fly transports or join supply, but the war needed pilots, not warnings, so he taught them everything. He showed them how to tame the Corsair on takeoff, how to counter its deadly torque, how to feel the stall coming, though the plane gave almost no warning. He made them practice blind landings, because in the Corsair you never saw the runway until the last second. He drilled Boeington's rules into them: never turn with a zero, keep altitude, fight vertical not horizontal, respect the aircraft or die. One student named Johnson from Nebraska reminded Walsh so strongly of James Stewart that it hurt. Johnson was bright, calm, always calculating angles like Stewart once did. Walsh trained him harder than all the others, criticized every landing, every maneuver because he wanted the boy to live. Johnson thought Walsh disliked him. But the opposite was true. Walsh knew that even perfect training sometimes failed because Stewart had all the tools and still died. Letters from the Pacific arrived now and then. The Corsairs were pushing toward Japan through places Walsh had only heard about. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The Japanese were using kamikaze attacks now. Desperate pilots trading their own lives for any chance to sink a ship. The Corsairs shot many of them down, but some always slipped through. Chen wrote once that the new kids were good but green, and that he missed the old squadron, which made no sense because the old squadron had been hell. But Walsh understood. There had been something strangely simple about that hell. You lived, you flew, you protected the man beside you. Everything else was noise. By 1945, Walsh had trained more than 300 pilots. Some wrote to thank him. Some never wrote, which usually meant they did not make it back. Their families sometimes wrote instead, thanking him for teaching their sons. Walsh kept those letters in a small box, never opening it. Each unread letter felt like a failure. Johnson graduated first in his class and received orders to join Chen's unit for F4U. Walsh shook his hand and tried to give him wisdom, but all he managed was the same line he had given others: do not turn with zeros. Johnson laughed, thinking it partly a joke. Months later, a letter reported that Johnson became an ace in 2 weeks, then was shot down over Kyushu. He survived and a submarine picked him up. Lucky or good, or both. May brought news that Germany had surrendered. One war ended. Another still roared across the Pacific. America prepared for an invasion of Japan that planners predicted would cost 1 million American lives and 5 million Japanese. The Corsairs would have been at the front of that storm. Then August came and everything changed. A single bomb destroyed Hiroshima. Another obliterated Nagasaki. Walsh heard the news in the ready room. Trainees cheered, thinking the war might finally end. Walsh felt everything at once and nothing at all. If one bomb could end it, why had so many friends died? On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was truly over. Walsh stood outside watching Corsairs practice landings, their wings bent like the ones he once trusted with his life. The war had turned that unwanted beast into a legend, but the cost could never be measured in kill ratios or aircraft counts. It lived in the weight carried by men like Walsh. It lived in the graves across the Pacific. It lived in the hands that never stopped shaking. And though Walsh would go on to live many more years, he would never forget the sound of 6 M2 Brownings firing, or the feeling of diving at 400 miles per hour into a sky filled with fire and death and brotherhood. The surrender of Japan ended the war for the world, but not for Walsh, because the echoes of gunfire and engine roar lived inside him in ways no discharge paper could erase. He returned to Pittsburgh in December 1945, wearing a uniform that looked too big for his thin frame. His mother cried openly at the sight of him, while his father, the silent veteran of the Great War, simply nodded, understanding what no one else could. Walsh tried to settle into a normal life, taking a quiet job at an accounting firm where the loudest sound was the clacking of typewriters. But normal life felt strange, too quiet, too clean. The sky outside the office windows looked empty without contrails of fighters weaving patterns of life and death. When he lay in bed at night, he heard the constant hum of the Corsair's engine and sometimes woke drenched in sweat, reaching instinctively for a control stick that was no longer there. He married a kind woman named Betty, who never pressed him to talk about the war. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. Walsh named the boy James Stewart Walsh, honoring the quiet math teacher who lifted his dying Corsair above the trees so many years before. He never told anyone the meaning of the name, could not bring himself to speak it aloud. Meanwhile, Chen returned to flying against doctor's orders because he was a man who needed the sky more than safety. He pushed himself beyond limits again and again until his luck finally ran out in 1952 when he died testing a new jet fighter. Walsh received the news in a quiet envelope and sat alone for a long time staring at the letter. He felt pride for his old friend and grief that reached down into the same wound the war had carved years earlier. Kowalski became a commercial pilot flying passengers across the country until he retired and eventually died peacefully at 91 years old. He likely dreamed of bent-wing Corsairs and climbing zeros until his final breath. Walsh lived a much longer life than he expected. He made it to 2001, still carrying the war inside him, though he rarely spoke about it. His children knew he had been a pilot, knew he had earned medals, but they did not know he had been an ace. They did not know he sometimes shook when a thunderstorm passed overhead. They did not know about the nights he sat awake, listening to memories of flames and metal tearing, and friends calling for help that never came. When Walsh finally passed away quietly surrounded by family, his son went through the attic searching for documents and found a small box wrapped in old cloth. Inside were 300 letters from the young pilots he had trained at Pensacola. Many thanked him, some asked for advice, some were written by families after their sons died in combat offering gratitude that he had prepared them well. Beneath the letters lay a worn list of names. Those who never came home, those whose absence hollowed out the man who kept this box hidden for decades. There was one more item, a Japanese 20mm shell with the explosive charge removed. Attached was a note written long ago in fading ink. This one had my name on it. Stewart got in the way. Pass it on. Walsh's son stared at the note, unable to understand its full weight, because how could he? To understand it, he would have needed to sit in a falling Corsair watching tracers streak past the canopy. He would have needed to feel the crushing force of a 450-mile-per-hour dive, or watch 3-0 fighters close in for the kill. He would have needed to see men like Stuart Morrison, White, Patterson, Chen give everything they had for the man beside them. Without those moments, the note was only words. With those moments, it was an entire lifetime. The Corsair itself outlived most of the men who flew it. It fought again in Korea and even in Vietnam, performing ground support missions long after most piston fighters had been retired. A few still fly today in airshows' engines, roaring just as they did over the Solomon Sea. The bent-wing bird that once terrified its own pilots became the longest-serving piston fighter in the history of the United States. But its legend was not built from metal and engines. It was built from the souls of young men who strapped into a machine that wanted to kill them as surely as the enemy did. Men who mastered it through fear, pain, endurance, and loyalty to one another. Men who learned its vicious tendencies and turned them into strengths. The Japanese pilots who laughed at the Corsair in 1943 learned quickly that the ugly bent-wing machine was not a clumsy truck, but death itself falling from 30,000 feet. The Corsair cut through battlefields like a blade. It erased, 0 fighters in single bursts of fire. It devoured bombers. It clawed upward through the sky with raw power no other fighter could match. But the cost of that power was etched into the men who flew it. Walsh carried that cost every day. In the quiet moments he saw flashes of the past. Stewart waving from his cockpit, Morrison talking about his sister, Chen bleeding through his flight suit, White whispering about rain, Patterson falling in his parachute, all of it drifting through his memory like smoke from a long dead fire. After his funeral, the family gathered as the sun set. His son held the 20mm shell and the list of names and understood only this. His father had lived a life shaped by courage and loss, by friends who had become brothers, by battles fought in a sky filled with fire. No statue, no ribbon, no medal could capture that life, only the memories held in silence. Only the echo of engines long gone, only the knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. The Corsair was retired from military service in 1957, but it stayed alive in the stories of those who survived it. Stories like Walsh, stories too large for words yet carried in a single faded note. Some things cannot be fully told. Some things can only be felt. The war ended. The planes vanished. The pilots aged. But the lessons remained. Survive. Protect the man beside you. Never stop climbing. Never stop fighting. And never forget the ones who earned the sky for those who came after. The war in Europe had ended with Germany's surrender. But in the Pacific, the storm still raged, and every man in Walsh's old squadron knew they would be needed again for the final and bloodiest chapter. B-29 bombers burned Japanese cities night after night, and American planners prepared for an invasion of the home islands that they believed would cost 1 million American lives and 5 million Japanese. The Corsairs would fly close support in that invasion, diving into walls of fire, just as they had done over Rabaul and Bougainville. Veterans whispered that even if they survived the war, their souls might not survive that final battle. Yet fate shifted in August when a single bomb leveled Hiroshima and another destroyed Nagasaki. Walsh heard the news in the Pensacola Ready Room, surrounded by young trainees who erupted with relief, convinced the war would end at last. He did not cheer. He simply sat there letting the weight of it settle on him. All the missions, all the friends, all the deaths. If a single bomb could end the war, why had Morrison died? Why had Stewart died? Why had so many gone into the sea or the jungle never to return? Questions without answers. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered and the world exhaled. Walsh walked outside and watched a pair of Corsairs practice landings in the fading light. Their engines rumbled softly. Their wings glowed gold in the sun. The bent-wing bird that had once been called a killer of its own pilots had become a legend. It had destroyed 2,300 enemy aircraft and achieved an 11-to-1 kill ratio. But numbers could not show the real story. They did not show Chen's shaking hands or White's last breath or Kowalski's grey hair at 24 or the raw terror that lived behind every pilot's eyes. They did not show the weight carried by the men who survived. After the war, Walsh returned home and lived a quiet life working in an office with pencils and ledgers instead of flight suits and machine guns. His children grew. His home grew warm with birthdays and holidays. Yet the war traveled with him like a shadow that refused to release him. Sometimes he would hear the far-off rumble of thunder, and his body reacted before his mind could think. Hands tightening, shoulders bracing, heart thudding. Sometimes he woke at night calling out for men who had died decades earlier. He rarely spoke about those memories because they existed in a language that only the men who had been there could understand. He aged quietly, worked quietly, loved his family deeply but silently. When he reached his final years, he began keeping to himself in the evenings, sitting on the porch staring at the sky as if waiting for something to return. When Walsh died in 2001, his son sifted through the attic and found the small wooden box that held the truth of his father's life. Letters from the young pilots he trained thanking him for saving their lives. Notes from families grieving their sons. Faded photos of the squadron gathered under coconut trees. a list of names he carried for half a century, those who never came home, and finally, the spent Japanese 20mm shell with the handwritten message saying this one had my name on it. Stewart got in the way. Pass it on. Walsh's son held the shell but could not grasp its meaning. How could he? He had not sat in a cockpit shaking with fear while Zeros swarmed around him. He had not listened to the scream of the wind at 400 miles per hour while death waited in every direction. He had not watched a friend dive his plane into an enemy or lift a dying aircraft on a wave of turbulence. Without those memories, the shell was only metal. With those memories, it was a life preserved by another man's sacrifice. The Corsair lived on even after the war. It fought again in Korea, dropping bombs and firing rockets against ground targets. Some even served in Vietnam, providing close air support in the early years. The bent-wing bird outlasted nearly every piston fighter ever built. It was born from metal and engineering, but its true legacy came from the men who flew it. Men like Walsh Chen, Stewart Morrison White Patterson, and so many others whose names lived only in fading logbooks and whispered stories. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at the Corsair in 1943 learned quickly that the strange-looking fighter with its gull-shaped wings was the deadliest thing in the Pacific sky. It dove faster than anything they had ever seen. It climbed with brutal strength. Its 6 M2 Brownings fired a storm of fire hot enough to melt through aluminum and ignite fuel tanks. It punished mistakes without mercy, yet rewarded mastery with unmatched power. But every burst of gunfire, every climb, every dive left marks on the pilots who commanded it. Walsh carried those marks for the rest of his life. He never fully escaped the sounds or the sights. Memories drifted into his thoughts without warning. The flash of a Zero exploding, the scream of wind in a vertical dive, the taste of blood in an oxygen mask after negative GS, the feeling of gravity trying to crush his ribs as he pulled out of a near-fatal descent. And the worst memory, the silence that followed after a friend vanished from the sky. He learned that survival was not simple. Surviving meant remembering. Surviving meant carrying the names of those who did not return. Surviving meant waking each day with a weight that no one else could see. After his funeral, the family gathered as the sun went down, the air was calm, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Walsh's son stood quietly holding the 20mm shell, feeling its cold metal in his palm. He understood only one thing. His father had lived a life of courage and sacrifice, a life forged in fire, a life shaped by the bent-wing Corsair and the men who flew beside him. The official history books would speak of kill ratios and tactics and engines, but the real story lived in that box in the attic. It lived in the friendships born at 30,000 feet. It lived in the fear and hope and loyalty that bound young men together in the vast emptiness of the sky. The Corsair was retired from service in 1957, but its shadow remained across decades, because some machines become more than metal. Some machines become memories of who we once were. The pilots who faced death every day carved their stories into the sky, and though their vapor trails vanished, their courage did not. Walsh carried that courage until his last breath, and in the end the story of the bent-wing bird was not just about war. It was about young men learning to fight impossible battles, about holding on to the man beside you, about rising into the sky again and again, even when fear clawed at your throat. It was about living through moments that changed the world and living afterward with the weight of those moments. Some debts the sky never lets go. Some stories the heart never forgets. And some heroes do not speak of what they survived because survival itself is the final chapter. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.